My poster focuses on the New England witch trials of the 17th century. We're going to be exploring the factors that contributed to the onset of the crisis as a whole, as well as the characteristics that made individuals more prone to being accused. Overall, you will see that there was no single factor that caused the witch trials, nor was there a particular characteristic that resulted in an individual being accused. Rather, it was a combination of specific circumstances that allowed the crisis to occur, and there were many factors that caused an individual to be accused. We'll be starting off the presentation with some background about the trials. According to page 22 of In the Devil's Snare by Mary Beth Norton, in January of 1692, Abigail Williams and her cousin Betty became the first two girls of the crisis to fall ill. Norton discusses the unusual symptoms of the girls displayed and notes that they did not respond to any sort of treatment. Page 24 of A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, written by John Hale, who is the pastor of the Church of Christ in Beverly, tells a similar story. Hale wrote that the afflicted girls were bitten and pinched by invisible agents. The arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that, and returned back again. So it was impossible for them to do of themselves, and beyond the power of any epileptic fits or natural disease to effect. The image shown here is of the title page of the same document. Per Norton, on pages 23 through 155, in the months that followed, the Indian slave Chichuba, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Rebecca Nurse, the Proctors, and many other individuals would be accused of witchcraft. On the right side of the slide here is a list of 11 accused persons and their accusers, titled Complaint of Several, May 28, 1692, alongside a census of prisoners that was compiled in May and June of the same year. According to Anthony Brandt in An Unholy Mess, by the time the witch trials concluded, more than 100 individuals had been tried, 19 of those had been hanged, and John Proctor, who refused to stand trial, was stoned to death. Mary Beth Norton attributes the witch trial crisis to two main factors present during the late 17th century. On page 287 of In the Devil's Snare, Norton discusses how the Puritans' worldview contributed to the hysteria. Norton describes how the Puritans believed that they were chosen by God to bring his message to a land that had been ruled by the devil. She writes that Puritans believed God communicated with them through natural events and disasters, the deaths of loved ones, and good fortune. They also believed that the spirit world was constantly surrounding them, but that world, including Satan, was ultimately controlled by God. Norton summarizes the Puritans' feelings about Satan using a quote from a sermon by Samuel Willard. Satan was the power of the air and the leader of the evil angels. Norton also puts emphasis on the role of the First and Second Indian Wars in starting the crisis. As Norton explains on pages 287 through 289, the war brought great misfortune to the people of New England. They lost livestock, houses, and the lives of their citizens. These conditions made it possible for the witchcraft crisis to develop so thoroughly. Norton notes that if it hadn't been for these wartime losses, it would have been unlikely that so many individuals would be convicted of witchcraft. On page 289, Norton lists the many wartime mistakes of the Bay Colony magistrates, and she notes that they probably wanted to shift the blame for the colony's misfortune away from themselves. The witch trials allowed them to do just that by shifting the blame onto God himself. The Puritans interpreted those losses they suffered during this time as punishment from God for their sins. When the girls in New England began having fits and blaming them on witchcraft, the Puritans once again interpreted this as punishment from God for their sins. God was allowing the witchcraft to operate. On page 288, Norton uses the words of the Reverend Deodat Lawson to summarize this thought process neatly, saying, "The Lord doth terrible things amongst us, by lengthening the chain of the roaring lion in an extraordinary manner, so that the devil is come down in great wrath." While Norton primarily focused on studying the causes of the witch trial crisis as a whole, Carol Carlson considered the factors that led to an individual becoming one of the accused in The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, Witchcraft in Colonial New England. Carlson shows that sex, marital status, age, and economic status all seem to have contributed to an individual's chance of being accused. On page 47, Carlson writes that the single most salient characteristic of witches was their sex. 78% of the accused were female, and of the men who were accused, over half were the husbands, sons, or public supporters of female witches. Shown on the screen here is a table from The Devil is the Shape of a Woman that breaks down the sex of accused witches. Carlson also makes an interesting point about the difference in the way men and women were treated once they were accused. On page 48, Carlson notes that authorities were more reluctant to consider accusations against men to be credible than they were to consider accusations against women to be credible. Carlson writes that they decided to try 37% of women, but they only decided to try 16% of men. Page 49 reveals that women who confessed were almost always put to death, while men who confessed were often simply fined or whipped. The image here was drawn by William A. Crafts in 1876, and it shows courtroom proceedings during the trials. Predictably, the accused is a woman. On page 69 of the book, Carlson notes that as much as 20% of the women who were accused of witchcraft were impoverished or living at a level of bare subsistence when they were accused. Carlson also indicates that it was not uncommon for the accused to be women who supported themselves with temporary labor, such as washing clothes or caring for the sick, servants, or even slaves. Though overrepresented, the poor were still in the minority of those who were accused. However, on page 70, Carlson explains that wealth did play a significant role in the actual prosecution of the accused. Women and families with estates worth less than £200 were overrepresented in the pool of prosecuted women. Carlson also deduces that marital status played a role in accusations and convictions. She argued that being unmarried seemed to make women most vulnerable to accusation and prosecution. The chart on this slide, pulled from page 66 of The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, shows that unmarried women over the age of 30 were overrepresented in accusations, trials, and convictions. So, why does all of this matter? The witch trial crisis of the 17th century illustrates the deep-seated ramifications of gender, race, and economic class. As we saw throughout the presentation, women were much more vulnerable to accusation and conviction than men. Also overrepresented in the pool of the accused were the poor and the unmarried, emphasizing the fact that prejudice of all kind had a hand in these proceedings. The witch trials also exposed some troubling issues with the legal system that, according to Martha M. Young in The Salem Witch Trials 300 years later, How Far Has the American Legal System Come?, might still exist today. Per Young, in much the same way that the accused were forced to submit to searches for a witch's tit during the trial, individuals can still be forced to, quote, incriminate themselves with their own bodies and submit, even before a warranted arrest, to humiliating and violative searches. The 1853 oil painting shown here depicts one such search. I first became interested in this topic in week 6. When we studied the New England Women and Material Cultural module. This is where I was first introduced to The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, Witchcraft in Colonial New England. The economic chapter from the book is included in our textbook. I ultimately purchased a copy of Carlson's work and read most of it for this project. This reading led to my topic choice because I had never considered that there might be economic commonalities between the women who were accused and prosecuted for witchcraft during this time period. I thought it was really interesting how systematic and structured the witch trials turned out to be, and I wanted to learn more about it. I initially only wanted to focus on women who were accused, but as I got deeper into the project, I became more interested in the factors that contributed to the crisis. This is reflected in my discussion of Mary Beth Norton's In the Devil's Snare. I still researched the commonalities between women who were accused, but as I continued through the project, I wanted to gain a broader knowledge of the witch trial crisis as a whole, and I ultimately completed an analysis of the factors that contributed to the trials as well as the factors that contributed to a woman being accused. If I were to continue this research, I would probably look more into the accusers themselves. I would want to better understand their backgrounds, and I would try to discover any common traits between the girls. What motivated them to accuse others? Was anything actually wrong with them, and how did others perceive them? I loosely relied on my studies of The Crucible from a literature class I took for this project. Though I didn't rely on the play for accurate information, it did help me get some background knowledge about the situation and help me understand the crisis.